So welcome everybody. Welcome to the second event of the Human Trafficking Seminar Series, organized in collaboration by BEEPR and the CCSTD as part of the project on called Human Trafficking Initiative at SAIS. Tonight, we have with us Professor Obiora Okafor, who is the Burling Chair in International Law and Institutions at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C. We are very, very grateful for the fact that you accepted our invitation. It is not only a great honor, but it is actually a great contribution, the one that you are about to bring to the debate on human trafficking, and especially on the practical side of human rights work at an international level. Connected with us online is my colleague and friend Alexandra Malangone, who is the practitioner in-house that collaborates at the Human Trafficking Project and who is a former member of the GRETA body, which is the Council of Europe monitoring body in the field of human trafficking. So I am sure that not only she will contribute with interesting comments regarding fact-finding, but for sure, both your comments combined will enrich our knowledge about the activity of fact-finding in the international human rights work. Now, of course, I don't need to go through the lengthy list of publication of Professor Okafor. What I'd like to mention right at the beginning is that not only Professor Okafor is an academic, but he is also a UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, and he is the former chairperson for the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. Of course, authored numerous books in the field of international human rights. And again, the perspective that we are really eager to hear about during this presentation is your perspective, which is both academic and practical with regard to fact-finding in the field of international human rights law. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to leave you the floor for your presentation, and then we're going to collect questions from the floor and eventually from online, from people online. People that are connected via Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read questions for Professor Okafor through the Q&A box. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor. I don't want to pronounce it.
My last name is a nightmare. You can call me Sarah. That's the easiest way to take it.
It's just I hear that across from here they teach the best Italian in the country. So I'm at risk if I mispronounce. So that's why I was hesitating. But I'm really happy to be here, both at this event, this seminar, and also at the Bologna Center of SAIS, Johns Hopkins. And thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation, and also to my colleagues here as well, and the director for inviting me for months now to come, but I had to find a time that I could manage in between teaching obligations in DC and so on. So I'm really, really glad to be here. It's not moving down. Okay. Sorry. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Good. So today I'm going to talk about improving international human rights fact-finding, what I call IHRFF acronym. So your screen is the outline of my hopefully not too long presentation. I'm going to begin by just some words on what I think international human rights fact-finding is, and then talk about who usually undertakes it, why it's important in international law and relations, and how I conducted the study on which this talk is based. And then on what does need to be improved and how we can do so. So that's how. So the caveat is that I wouldn't have time in the short time that we'll have to get I wouldn't into sort of great depth into every single thing that I say, but in conversation, perhaps I can clarify things if need be. All right. So starting with the first point on my outline, what is international human rights fact-finding? Of course, it's it's been defined, as you can see. Good definition is from Theo Boutrouche and others as a method of ascertaining facts, right, through the evaluation and compilation of various information sources and so on, to illuminate causes and consequences and aftermath of events, and form a systematic, is under keyword, collection of facts, right? Now, of course, I don't need to bore you with the fact that our understanding of facts is mediated, right? And depends on how you collect the facts, right? So two people can attempt to collect facts and reach varying conclusions. So that is one issue to keep in mind. So, but understood in this way is not really new, right? Human rights fact finding has been going on for a long time. Issues relating to sort of how to do it, ways and means, conceptual issues, operational problems, and best practices. I have to go into my UN mode once in a while because UN loves that term, best practices. So a lot of scholars have written, I just list a lot of the work that this is by no means, does it even scratch the surface of those, but these are some notable, very good works on fact-finding in the past, including by Philip Alston. I must mention Philip Alston, sort of the preeminent international human rights scholar of our time. But not nearly enough, in my view, has changed since the 60s, right? And, you know, others have said so as well. Not nearly enough has changed while the rate of activity, the quantity of international human rights fact-finding has exploded exponentially. And I think that required more study, right? In terms of what's going well, how it can be improved. So who usually undertakes it? A number of actors. You can think of UN bodies, for example. The Council does have its own, a host of fact-finding mechanisms, shall we say. So it has subsidiary bodies, for example, who find facts, special procedures that are called special rapporteurs, independent experts, sometimes particular fact-finding commissions are established. There's one for Ethiopia now. I think that was the latest one with regard to the war, a civil war in Tigray, largely. UNDP does that. Security Council even does that. So that's sort of UN. It doesn't exhaust it. Regional organizations, for example, the ones you see, international NGOs, Amnesty and so on, certain local NGOs, for example, American Civil Liberties Union and so on, and government states. The US State Department's report is one very prominent report based on its fact-finding on every other country in the world, like, basically. So fact-finding is a very broad, international human rights fact-finding is a very broad activity. So in the research, I couldn't focus on all that, otherwise I'll still be doing it today and probably till I retire. You know, so I had to limit it in some way. But before I get there, you know, Franz Villon, who's at Pretoria, University of Pretoria, has sort of offered a very useful taxonomy that differentiates three kinds of international human rights fact-finding: the investigative type that the Human Rights Council and others, and at times some NGOs use it a lot, right? indirect when states file, for example, when states file their periodic reports to the human rights treaty bodies set up under the various human rights treaties. It's indirect because the treaty bodies don't go into the field necessarily to find facts. It's just states send facts, and there are shadow reports from civil society groups, and the truth, as they say, might lie somewhere in the middle, and it's indirect from those sources. And then complaints based in national human rights fact finding. For example, the Human Rights Council's complaint mechanism, which is little known, right? When there are patterns of gross abuse of human rights, and the key word here is patterns, you can actually petition the Human Rights Council directly, not the UN treaty bodies like the Committee Against Torture or something like that. That is complaint-based, right? You make a complaint, it alleges facts, and there's some fact-finding. So we as the UN warned, we have to distinguish between these types and not lump all of them together. They're not the very exact same activity. They're species of it, and those species, just like I hate to be a bit morbid, different variants of COVID. They're similar, but they're not the same thing, right? They behave differently. So, so that kind of question, pervaded my research, and I decided to focus on investigative human rights international human rights fact finding as conducted by the UN, international NGOs, local NGOs, or by a single country. Okay, so I'm not focused on the last two of the category indirect or complaints. Now, why is it important to us, international relations people, international law people? The fact-finding in national human rights fact-finding and the reports that are based on it are crucially important, not just because of the information they provide, but also because of a host of other reasons, right? Very consequential reasons in many cases. They could ground and legitimize even military action that lead to loss of lives, right? You have WMDs, weapons of mass destruction or not, where chemical weapons used or not. Some red lines are drawn, for instance. You have to find the facts in order to then say, hopefully you have to find the facts and then say, this is why we then authorize this kind of action. Economic and other sanctions are often based on that can damage economies and societies and cost lives and rights. Development aid is often refused based on facts that are found, or cut. Legitimization or delegitimization of state or non-state actors can occur. They're being suspended from particular bodies. For instance, they provide early warning in some cases to avert conflict or further violence. Gross or mass human rights suffering can result from international rights fact-finding, depending. And it also matters because virtually all these measures are grounded in international or domestic legal frameworks, right? So it matters to an international lawyer, and they can foster international domestic legal change, or at least pressure for such change to occur. Okay, so that's why we need to do the best we can to do it carefully, as knowledgeably, and as rigorously as we can. Now, so what was the methodology of the study, which I'm talking? It was based on both primary and secondary sources. So in terms of primary sources there, I looked at the contents of a set of actual international human rights fact-finding reports, those produced by UN agencies and NGOs, and other pertinent documents, such as the facts and figures document that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights produced. I also looked at secondary evidence, secondary data, if you like, academic and other analysis on the subject, the relevant theoretical literature, okay? There was also a geographic limitation on the research. I again, limited the data set to international human rights fact-finding in relation to the African continent, again, to further limit in a rigorous way that data. Otherwise, I would have had to deal with thousands and thousands of long reports, Temporal limitations, I chose the immediate 5-year period before the research, okay? So that there's a rigorous set of boundaries drawn for the work. So why does international human rights fact-finding need improvement? What are the concerns or issues with it? And I don't have time to talk about all of them. So I'm gonna illustrate the couple, okay? And I mean, do I mean to an American couple? As a joke, right? American couple can be more than two. Anyway, I'm sure Justin is a bit embarrassed by that as an Englishman. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so 2 examples, an actual couple. The first is what I call, or actually I didn't call, I took this on anthropology, critical anthropology, Kamari Clark's work, to be precise, the conceptual economy of appearances, right, in international human rights fact-finding. And what does this mean? So, for example, a person or group or other actor or country even is featured as a culprit, right? They violated X, right? That's a human rights violator, without necessarily looking at the full cycle, right, that led to that, right? So a moment in time is frozen, there's something happening. That something happening may be a response to something else that happened historically. But when we find facts, we just go and find fact in the moment. Is a conceptual economy, right? That limits what we are seeing, what we look at. We don't look at that full cycle that fed or feeds the chain of events that we're witnessing in the present, that in the end produces or produced the human rights violation at issue, all right? So that's what is meant by the highfalutin concept of conceptual economy of appearances. Right. So, for example, take land reform, which is a hugely controversial issue in Southern Africa, especially colonial era dispossessions are rarely taken seriously in international human rights fact-finding, at least at the time that I was looking at this work. Even in the reporting by NGOs, what more, say, by the US State Department, right? So the reporting about land dispossession was as if somehow somebody just woke up and dispossessed, right? And human rights violations there. There was very little accounting of the fact that the land that was being dispossessed was itself dispossessed, right? And it matters a lot whether that land was dispossessed, including from people who are still alive, even if they were not alive, right? So what happens then is that full cycle is backgrounded. And then when you background something that should be in the foreground, the picture looks very different from how it will look. And it distorts the narrative, not just in the media, but in the law and the courts. And this is highly contested, right? And then you apply international law to facts, right? So this is problematic. And you do so when, in fact, the 2 types of suffering that ought to be addressed are important. Are you getting me? Both the earlier dispossessions and the current dispossessions. But when you background one completely, you produce different outcomes. So I apply this conceptual apparatus from critical anthropology to that data set. The second problem that I have time to speak about today is what I call doing IHRFF, or National Human Rights Fact-Finding, from too high an orbit, right? Or drive-by, which is a kind of American thing. Sorry, I don't mean the gun one, but driving by. Sorry, I couldn't resist that low-hanging fruit. So basically, when you do, you watch, I don't know about you, but I'm a bit of a space, I watch everything about space, right? So when you're watching something from too high an orbit, you see the thing, but you miss critical detail. You don't see it in the granular, or at least as granular a form as possible, right? So that often happens, and what happens then is you miss the depth, you miss the nuance, and it distorts reality ultimately. You don't know that reality is being distorted, but you do distort reality, and ultimately, if you then base legal analysis and outcomes on it, itself, that distortion feeds into it, is my argument. So my data show that on average, UN international human rights fact-finding missions last 1 week, right? Some are up to 2 weeks, like, for example, special rapporteurs now, although I was actually forced to do a 1 week mission, which I didn't like because of resources. So I have a personal experience with this as well, and have long pushed for longer missions, sometimes to the chagrin of bureaucrats. But of course, there are resource constraints, right? It's not just because they don't want me to go for longer. There are resource constraints on the supply side, actually, two supply sides, the UN supply side, and mine, because I'm doing this work part-time. So I can't take more than 2 weeks. I was in Costa Rica just last month. I can't take more than 2 weeks. I still had to teach anyway by Zoom, thank God for Zoom. But I couldn't take more than 2 weeks unpaid time, actually, at least unpaid from the UN to do this work. The COVID-19 pandemic even gave some within the UN Office of Human Rights an excuse to begin to ask us to do Zoom missions, which we rejected outright. You know, you can imagine that kind of high orbit, right? Yeah, you can meet all of them by Zoom. Why not, right? On the surface, it makes sense, but it doesn't. You don't get the kind of well, I even hesitate to say, even going for 2 weeks, you get an in-depth appreciation, right? So I was telling the Africa Club today how you go in, and I'm scheduled. I have to wake up for 2 weeks, 5 a.m. every morning, because my meetings start at 7 mostly, and I get back usually by 7, 8 p.m. So for those 2 weeks, just trying to pack in as many meetings as I could to try and get some understanding. I remember doing my end of mission statement with the ambassadors of the foreign ministry, and they were shocked that I even understood anything. Even them were skeptical as to whether I was going to understand the situation, right? So you see what the difficulty is with kind of 1 week missions, even 2 weeks. So NGO missions tend to last longer. So you have to distinguish between UN missions and NGO missions. They tend to last longer. One has to say that, even though I don't think even them tend to be long enough. So my point is that sustained on-the-ground study appears to be the exception, not the rule, right? Not that it doesn't happen. It's just that it doesn't happen often enough. And yet, we know from the International Bar Association reports, many other reports, that this is extremely important for local knowledge, in-depth local knowledge, and so on. Against this background, the increasing advocacy for satellite imagery to be used in human rights fact-finding should be welcome, but also should be viewed with some skepticism, right? Because satellite imagery on its own can help, but cannot replace on-the-ground work. I don't know if you all saw the movie about how Bin Laden was caught, right? Satellite imagery played a role, but actually how he was caught was by agents being on the ground day in, day out for almost years on end. And finally, they were listening around the market and following that car of the courier, right? To get an idea. You know, you can't replace that. I'm not saying international human rights fact-finding is catching Bin Laden. I'm just saying it gives you an idea of how irreplaceable actual on-the-ground close engagement can be, no matter all the drones and satellites that you have. So the point being that doing international human rights fact-finding from too high an orbit or long distance can be problematic. This point have been made, but what I did with my data, it was made before me, set is to show its persistence even today. right? That's what I did. Like I said, there are other problems like the CNN effect. The money and the resources tends to go wherever the CNN cameras turn to. There's even talk now of the Al Jazeera effect as well. So basically where the media focuses is as if, you know, there's no other fact-finding to be done. Of course, I'm sympathetic to the resource limitations. We only have 24 hours in a day, there's limited money, and so on. But I don't have time to get into all that. But how can you ameliorate or perhaps even fix some of these deficiencies? Well, if you take the question of doing international human rights fact-finding from too high an orbit or in a drive-by way, I think that the intensification of the on-the-ground method is required, right? As much as possible within given resources, right? So more substantial periods of time. In the paper itself, I show that the UN can actually do it at very little cost, right? So basically, any of those missions costs between 40 to 50,000 US dollars for, just example, a special rapporteur, right? So I go into actually the budget and all that, and I show that just for an additional 20,000, you can do it, you know. And so I think that they can do it, but not to do 1 year fact finding, but at least maybe 4 weeks, you know, that sort of thing. Now, and it's important because the potential for error is significantly greater at high orbit. And then, anyway, I've said this before, so I'll skip it. Now, the second, in terms of ameliorating the ill effects of the conceptual economy of appearances, as I call it, we should better balance contemporary present-day information gathering with a rich understanding of the socio-historical context. This is extremely important. So a continuum between yesterday and today, right? That's what I'm basically arguing for. Because it's only in this way that can we capture the complications that are often present and sort of the manifold circumstances that produce that reality and that shaped the situation we're interested in. Now, critical ethnography can help us in this regard is what I argue, with its tradition, though not exclusive, is non-exclusive tradition, but it has a rich tradition of studying really small spaces in depth for a long time. So you have, you know, an anthropologist going to, say, a town, a village somewhere, and 20 years there. Literally, though, it's like those anthropologists with a little brush, and all that. You know, we can't do that. We can't fully replicate that because of the nature of international human rights fact find. But I think that the closer we move toward that, the better. That's what I'm trying to say. It's kind of broad model, not that we should, go with brushes, and spend, 30 years, looking for facts. It's just a broad guide. And I take this from Sally Angomeri, the late Sally Angomeri's work, especially the wonderful article, if you haven't read it, please read it, that she wrote before she died, Anthropology and International Law. A brilliant piece. She's an ethnographer, she's an anthropologist. So as Mary tells us, both international human rights fact-finding and critical ethnography share two common features. Obviously, they both gather data, they look for facts, and they also use strikingly similar methods, right, to access such data, interviews, and so on, and all that. But as she also tells us, they're also quite different in important regards. The main one being that successful activists tend to tell or aim to tell compelling stories, personal cases, right? with simple storylines. If you go out and you make it too complicated, if you're an NGO activist, you know, you're gonna work against your own case, right? You're gonna actually, you know, I wouldn't mention the journal. I once sent an article to a journal and they're like, why are you saying your findings are modest? You know, it undercuts the argument, make it stronger, robust, you know, just overclaim. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to overclaim. I'm a scholar, right? But you don't do that if you're an NGO, because people are going to immediately jump on it. Oh, but your case is modest, weak. So we don't need to act. Are you getting my point? But I have the luxury of that nuance and saying, look, yeah, I found some significant impact, but it's quite modest. It's not massive, right? And things like that. Activists rather don't have that luxury. They have to tell these simple storylines of suffering and responsibility. Clearly, who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator? You don't say, oh, this is the perpetrator, but he's kind of kind at the same time, or nice. You don't say that, right? You can't be that nuanced. Or here's a victim, but the victim is also a perpetrator, by the way. There has to be that compelling, simple storyline, demarcate responsibility clearly, and to get outrage and action, right? On the part of whoever we want action from. That's to be more straightforward, more emotionally engaged, right? Academics are more likely to tell the kind of story that the journal didn't want me to tell, which is a more complex, involuted to complicated story with nuance and intricacy. Of course, I'm not advocating that international human rights fact-finding and critical ethnography will become a unity, become the same thing. Clearly not, right? They would never be. Yet, I think that national human rights fact-finding can become a bit more like its academic cousin. Will this ever happen? Well, hope they say springs eternal. Thank you so much. It's been a great honor to visit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I think you offered numerous hints for the debate now. So what I suggest we do is let me gather questions from the floor. If anyone in the room has one, please let me know. There you go. Please say your name if you wish to. This I can introduce if you want. This is Professor Appleton, of course.
It's Arthur Appleton.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very well-organized, methodical presentation. You glossed over one issue, and I realize it's not 100% germane to the presentation, but it's very relevant now, and that is the role of media in the investigation process. And I'm thinking about the atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine and the fact that there is fact-finding going on by the media, but it's not in the official UN context. It's not a formal process, yet it is immediate and reflects really almost first on the ground. Can that be slotted into investigation, or is that something entirely different and not relevant from the UN type perspective?
Thank you so much, Professor Appleton, for that great question. You promised to deliver a great question, and you delivered. You're what Americans call the mailman. Yeah? He's American, so that's answer is okay. Some amelioration. I'm just joking. Anyway, but thanks so much for that question. I think that the media does good investigative. I'm thinking of a famous one, Watergate, right? You can think of excellent investigative journalism, fact-finding. It's not really necessarily human rights, although you could see a human rights dimension to Watergate, right? And so can do good. And often it is the media fact-finding that triggers even UN investigation in the first place, right? That's why I glossed over it. I kind of mentioned in the paper, I do discuss it, of the CNN effect. So where the cameras go, where the media goes, and all that. So I think they can do that. And sometimes at great personal cost, actually. And, in the Ukraine context, it may be that actually only the media that can, be crazy enough to go and put their lives at risk, where bombs are still falling, bullets are still being rained at, and find these things, right? Facts. So I think it can be slotted into fact-finding more general, although it's not one of the categories that I sort of looked at in this particular study, but I do realize, and I discuss it, where that their fact-finding matters, right? For even the fact-finding that the UN and NGOs undertake, But I would argue that some of, not necessarily all the issues that I raised would apply. They don't tend to do it from long distance as well. And they tend to do it over time, at least have repeated, shall we say, familiarity with the local circumstance. They tend to. Yeah. Thank you.
There you go. Go ahead, Daniel.
Hi, my name's Daniel. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I had a question about the conceptual economy of appearances framework that you were discussing, and sort of how can the socio-historical context from which human rights violations manifest enter into a court of law? How can it, what's its role to play in the case? And if it hasn't got a role to play in a court, then is it a limitation of fact-finding or of the human rights regime as a whole? Like the example I kind of had in mind was with the recent Amnesty International report about Israeli apartheid. Palestinian activists said that, this is useful, but it's not dealing with the colonial roots or the settler colonial roots of the situation, which have then created the circumstances within which an apartheid regime manifests. And so is it a limitation of human rights writ large? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that in terms of the court ones, which is what you mentioned, right? I think that there's already apertures, there's already windows through which that can enter, right? I'm thinking of expert evidence, right? So the lawyers are nodding. So it is, for example, I wouldn't mention what cases because we lost it in the end, but there's a certain case of oil in Niger Delta in which I did an expert. I didn't even go into court, but I wrote an expert report, and I was able to provide to a foreign court expert evidence. This was more a conflict of laws matter on the laws of Nigeria, because although it was a foreign court, the matter was going to be decided on laws of Nigeria. So the judge is not trained, didn't know this law. So I came in as an expert in Nigerian law. There are anthropologists who have testified, historians testify, doctors. That's what most people are used to in criminal cases, testify, and so on. So I think through the expert evidence route, you could bring that in, right? I think that in certain cases in Canada, bordering on racial discrimination, for example, judges have taken judicial notice of it. There are prosecutors that have taken judicial notice of it. So, for example, you're dealing with a particular circumstance, and they've taken note of a history of, say, racial discrimination against indigenous peoples, for instance, in looking at, not necessarily that that's determinative in any one case, but situating what they're seeing in that context of that, right? And also in sentencing even. So I think there's a window in the case of courts, right? But if it's, say, a special rapporteur of the UN, for instance, going to a country and interviewing people, for me personally, it allows me, reading the history and kind of the sociology and anthropology of the place allows me first to determine who I want to talk to, right? So for example, given my own particular training and reading and all that, I always in many countries want to talk to indigenous peoples. In Costa Rica, I made sure I went to an indigenous territory. I always want to talk to racialized minorities, all kinds of minority groups. So, but that's me, right? But that's me taking account of history, but also of other things and present, right? So even in selecting my interview subject, that factors in so that I can better account for all that in my assessment and not just that. So for example, I met with all marginalized groups representatives to the extent that, you know, a few people can represent all of them, but, you know, you do what you can in 2 weeks. That's what I mean. I couldn't go to the east coast of Costa Rica, which is heavily populated by people of African descent, a province called Limon. I couldn't because, again, time, resources. But I made sure that I met with leaders from there. For instance, I went up to the north, close to the border with Nicaragua, to an indigenous people's territory, and so on. All women's groups, all kinds, I made sure. And I always ask them about the history. Situate it for me, right? You know, what is the trajectory? Is it going up or down? Like, you know, I need to know, right? Just saying, okay, now what is going on may not necessarily. I could have taken, for example, the fact that the vice president, at least under the last election, was a woman and a Black woman. I could say, oh, Uhuru, you know, Swahili, you know, it's all over freedom. There's gender parity and there's no discrimination against Black people, right? You know what I mean? So that's a very high office, the vice president. You could read what you want, but I didn't. And I said, what is the history? And then to what extent has it been ameliorated? And then what is her location in all of this, right? Those kinds of questions. So I try to, you know, do what I can. I could go on and on, but I hope I've tried to answer your question. Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Tim?
Hi, my name is Tim. In your opinion, is human rights fact-finding investigations improving over the next, or have they improved, or are they improving over the next few years? Because I look at examples like Syria and like Russia and Ukraine and Xinjiang and China, and how countries like these are stonewalling these investigations and preventing independent investigations from even happening, and like they don't belong to any like criminal courts or anything like that. Do you think there will be human rights investigations, there'll be fact-finding missions? Will justice in that sense ever happen, or is that something like that we just have to kind of like accept?
So I said, great question. It is quite broad. How much time do you have? I'm just joking. So more generally, is it improving or not? I think so. I think generally it's improving. It doesn't mean it's perfect, or, you know, there are no problems, you know. But in terms of your sort of narrower question, right? The sort of the narrower sort of level of your question, I think maybe you're in some sense, I don't know whether this is how your mind talking about how power, right, kind of limits and constrains fact-finding, power relations, because in a place like Syria, ironically, it's also Russia that protected it to an extent in at least in the Security Council. So yes, there is the shall we say bump, or it's not even is much more than a bump, a wall that you kind of have to hit your head at if you keep pushing, that is constructed by realities of power asymmetry, right? So it is difficult to do national human rights fact-finding against certain powers. It is just difficult, or for it to even authorized, right? So, and it's also, of course, domestic regime type matters, right? Some like the Costa Ricans, for example, it's not just whether it's a smaller country or not. They have 100 years of democracy. So they actually want you to find the fact and tell them, to the extent that any government wants you to find the fact. They are one of the most open that I found in that sense, right? Doesn't mean they're perfect, don't get me wrong, but you see more of that. Okay, of course, this is how it happens, this is how democracies work, even if we don't implement it perfectly, but let us know what you think, right? There are some countries, of course, you would never even move anywhere without a minder, right? So the extent to which you can actually find any facts, it's debatable, If the minder only directs you here, it's all prepared and painted over by the time you get there. So that reduces, that imposes limitations on, shall we say, the robustness of your findings, right? So it's a reality that we have to deal with. Do we have to accept it? I don't think we have to accept it. I think we have to keep working, struggle against such limitations, but it's there for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
So before I share with you a question from a member of the audience online, Leonie, may I just build on this question and add with a follow-up? What seems to be very specific about the situation in Ukraine and the necessity to investigate war crimes occurring there seems to be the abundance of information that we have. My colleague Alexander Molangone online is mentioning the fact that in many countries bordering Ukraine, there are ongoing investigations. Testimonies by alleged victims are being collected right now by independent NGOs, by journalists. There is going to be a considerable amount of information coming from both the private initiative of individuals on the ground and through the use of technology, which leads me to the question. You discussed the orbit effect, which again, you use the example of satellite images as one of the examples, saying it might give you information, but these informations may not be sufficiently close to the actual reality of the phenomenon. May this orbit effect be applied as an interpretative tool also to this new situation which seems to arise in Ukraine, which is mainly linked to the abundance of information thanks to the use of technology, thanks to the private initiatives of NGOs on the ground. People are big private agents trying to extract civilians from Ukraine from very dangerous situations. And this seems also to be very similar to what happened with the war crimes investigation in Syria, where there was too much information. And one of the possible solutions that was put forward was archiving, working more on archiving all of this information because of the abundance and because of the technology. Do you think this could be a sort of compensation for the orbit effect?
Well, that's another great question. Yes, to start from sort of the last question. Yeah, archiving, of course, carefully, systematically archiving, which allows you also to cross-reference, and all that. Yeah, exactly. It's of course absolutely very useful technique in that context. And it is good that, I mean, not the events are good, but it is good that it's been applied, that there's this abundance of information that modern media and technology and all that allows these atrocities to be ferreted out and put in our faces in a stark way, in a way is good, right? In the past, you might not even know about it for years or at all, quite frankly, or even if you know about it, it's buried somewhere, in your consciousness, right? So I think that's useful. And by the way, the satellites are useful, right? So I don't want to leave the impression that they're not. I'm just saying maybe not sufficient in and of themselves. They will not replace on the ground work. Certainly Zoom wouldn't. Zoom, God knows I couldn't teach my class yesterday without Zoom. So Zoom is useful as well. But I'm just saying that I would resist any attempt to reduce UN special rapporteur fact finding to Zoom meetings. You know what I mean? It's kind of limited, limits you a lot in the way. And I'll tell you this tale. I don't think I've told it in public. So I did a mission to Qatar, for instance, right? And the report is public now, so I can talk about it a bit. And I made sure, not that anybody stopped me, but just to be sure, I wanted to talk to workers. The workers that build the stadiums. For those who like soccer or football would know. We call it football, right, Justin? Yeah. I'm poking at the American. I'm just joking. They call it soccer down there. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to them. I didn't want to talk to them in a context where they thought that anybody might be watching or whatever. So I had a very clever human rights officer from the bureaucracy. And I just mentioned in passing, he didn't say anything. So he arranged it all, including using, I don't know how he did it, but changing cars, not making me trek around where the migrants were living, he must have worked for some intelligence service, I don't know, just to make sure nobody was following us. And we actually went and we had dinner with them where they lived, a group of them who he had arranged, and we were able to talk to them. And I can tell you very freely, I wanted to make sure of that, because if I announced I was going to meet a group of them in this hotel room and blah, 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 they may not feel comfortable, right? In doing it. So technology can be good and be deployed in creative ways. It's all credit to him, not me. He's the one who arranged it and all that. But we just have to be careful, systematic in terms of how we deploy it, whether we see it as sufficient ways and means or not, would be what I would say. Yeah, so archiving, of course, is excellent.
As promised, I'm going to read the question by Leonie online.
Okay.
So given the difficult balance between using input from in-group local individuals and out-group foreign individuals, how can you make sure that the fact-finding remains centered on the issue but set in the relative context of other international issues at hand? There are also brackets that specify the in-country, out of the country group. As the local individuals understands the socio-cultural context, but are placed in a bias and hold personal stake, while the out groups may have more balanced perspectives, but they may lack the nuance, the depth in terms of knowledge.
That's an interesting question. I'm just wondering, I mean, maybe I'm too much of a skeptic. The first question that came to my mind was, why would we want to balance it against international issues? Is what I'm thinking. I'm not dismissing that aspect. I was trying to think through that. I'm just trying to understand the author's question, essentially, the relative context of other international issues. That's interesting. Anyway, if I take the question, main sort of gist of the question to be, how do you balance the in-group, the locals, right? What they tell you with what you hear from non-locals. Is that? I think that's more the question. I think that for me, if I've gone into a particular country, my primary, so maybe that's the balance. The primary source of information is local. I try not to, and there has been internal debates in my human rights team about this. I try not to go in saying Amnesty International did a study on this 5 years ago and they found this, therefore I have to find something that aligns with it. I try not to do that. Now, can I totally purge that from my head? Is the question. But I consciously try to find what I can find, because really at the end of the day, it's for it to be robust, it's my finding that I have to defend. I can't sort of do hearsay. Maybe I'm too much of a lawyer, right? I can't say someone else found this 5 years ago. That's what I try to do. But the way then I triangulate is making sure that I ask different groups that are in different positions and have different incentives the same question.
Yeah.
And see what. So if, for example, the government in a country X says, well, we've actually changed the kafala system, which is the system they have in most Arab countries of foreign labor, and we put in X, Y human rights protection, right? The government will always say that, but I need to ask the workers themselves. I need to ask the labor ministry, I need to ask NGOs, I need to ask the ILO, the National Labor Organization, and then I see what coincides. The governments tend to have a tendency to inflate, even if slightly, right? It is natural what they've done, their achievements. They will celebrate it. The workers might say, yes, but here are the nuances. Yes, the law was passed, the regulation was issued, but you know what? In practice, here is how we are not yet benefited. Things like that. So I find that's what I try to do mostly. Thank you. I don't know if I really attended to the question, but yeah.
I think you did.
Yeah.
Thank you. If the work you mentioning the workers' rights and possible exploitation of work kind of helps me to follow up with a question by Alexandra Malangone based on her experience as a former member of the Greta monitoring body. Again, is it the Greta monitoring body is a monitoring body competent for Council of Europe member states that focuses on human trafficking. And as you understand, exploitation of workers is a big part of this work. And definitely I can tell from the answer that you gave to this question that a lot of her experience does match your experience in tackling these issues. So I'm leaving the floor to Alexandra for her comment and her question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. My question was building up on your previous answer, and again linking my work under Greta Committee as an independent expert and as a human rights defender, as a lawyer who has been directly in the field, working mostly with victims of human trafficking and other human rights violations. I was wondering who, in your view, has the most suitable position to access information provided by survivors or by witnesses from various actors that are there on the ground. Always having in mind that we need to be able to avoid secondary victimization or ensure safety and confidentiality. Also not cause kind of sensation, but rather maybe serve the purpose of documenting, investigating, and hopefully prosecuting. And this is also bridges back to, for example, situation in Ukraine. What would be your views on this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yet another excellent question. I maybe the way to answer it in my mind is to say who is not in the best position to gather. Certainly not, in my view, the security operatives who if they're not extremely well trained and sensitized, right, in those contexts. I think that groups who advocate for the rights of victims generally have the training and the sensitization to be able to seek this information in the sensitive way, with the sensitivity it deserves, right? And know, better able to recognize the dangers when they see them, and also perhaps to be trusted by victims who, as you can imagine, not generally in a position to trust too many people, right? Who may have trauma and so on. So I think that that's extremely important. I think that I think the Canadian, some there's nothing like the Canadian police. Some Canadian police forces now make sure that they have social workers who have appropriate training and all that, do this kind of work, at least do, even if they attend, have them do the primary information gathering and all that. So I think that it is people with that sufficient amount of training and sensitization, and who are in a position to be better positioned to be trusted by victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Is there any other question in the room? If not, I would like to close at this point, unless there's a follow-up on the answer to my question. So what do you think is the worst mistake possible that a human rights fact finder can do while carrying out his job? So of course, we don't want to know names, we don't want to have details, we don't want to know who you're thinking about or what you're thinking about when you answer, but what is really the worst mistake in your opinion that one should avoid?
Are you asking me to indict myself?
I shall not. As a human rights lawyer, I shall not.
I'm just joking. I think, and this is something that often in the annual meeting of special procedures, we remind ourselves because it's that important. I think that it is putting those you're trying to help in greater danger, or at least in danger, right? Just because you want the facts, right? So in the balance between getting the facts and endangering the victim, or endangering them further, or putting increasing the threat to them, I think that you should pass on finding the fact. So I think that one should be reflexive about that. How am I going to endanger them? Right? Because there's always the threat of retribution in many societies against people who are already oppressed and all that. I think that's probably one of the worst mistakes. Yeah.
Thank you. Not only I agree, but you confirm what I tell students in class. So I'm happy to see they're smiling with it. So it's confirmed. You see, it's confirmed that we all care about the victims. That's the most important thing to us. So that really makes the difference. So if there is no other question, I thank you all for attending this seminar. And of course, my biggest thank you is to Professor Okafor. Thank you again for visiting SAIS Europe and for being with us.